Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today at the Global Forum hosted by the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy. My name is Ethan Brosman, and I'm a second-year graduate student at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, where I'm studying international management and economics. Today's topic is the future of manufacturing and global supply chain, and intends to incite meaningful dialogue on issues that are impacting global economic engagement and to inform prudent policymaking. Joining me today for today's discussion is the director of the center, Renee Bowen, as well as our special guest, Jeff Immelt. Renee has a joint appointment at our very own School of Global Policy and Strategy, as with the Department of Economics, UCSD. She is also director of the Center of Commerce and Diplomacy. She is a member of the California's Governor's Council on Economic Advisors, a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Our special guest today is Jeffrey Immelt. Jeff served as chairman and CEO of General Electric for 16 years, where he led innovative transformations that doubled industrial earnings, reestablished market leadership, and quadrupled earnings market revenue, and was named as one of the world's best CEO 3 times by Barron's. In addition, Jeff was named as one of Times Magazine's 100 most influential people in 2009, as well as the 2003 Financial Times Man of the Year. Jeff also chaired the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness under the Obama administration. Currently, Jeff is a venture partner at New Enterprise Associates, as well as an author of his book, Hot Seat: What I Learned Leading a Great American Company, which comes out today. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ethan.
Before we start with some questions, a few notes on the format of today's discussion. The first 40 minutes will be Renee and myself posing questions for Jeff to answer, and then we will take questions from the audience for the last 20 minutes. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A portion on your screen at any time during the session. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but we will have to end at 9 a.m. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Renee to start with the questions and give a little bit of background.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And Jeff, thanks for joining us. Yeah, we look forward to this conversation. We're hosting a rather important conference discussing the future of the global trading system. And that's hosted by the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy here at GPS. The conference comes in time. As we speak, the international economy is shifting under our feet. And the Executive Vice President of the European Commission just launched a new course for EU trade policy, defining the strategy as open, sustainable, and assertive. We also have that the the UK and China recently signed an agreement on investment known as CAI. And prior to that, China recently formed the 12-country membership RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And this includes some countries from ASEAN. So as these global alliances are shifting and we're seeing more regional agreements, it's really important for us to think about supply chains and how this is affecting supply chains. So from your perch at GE, I'm sure you had a lot of thoughts on this and a lot of experience with this. So before I jump into my own questions, I sort of just want to open it up to you for any opening thoughts.
Thanks, Renee and Ethan, and great to be with a part of your conference again. It's such a great institution. I would only echo, Renee, what you said about what an important moment this is, really for the future of global trade and America's role in it. You know, we're coming through the COVID crisis. We have a recent administration change in the US, and the rest of the world is on the move, especially China. And then overlaying all of that is just a wave of technology that is going to be disruptive in the supply chain. So I just think it's you know, there's not necessarily any one moment that's more important than another, but I think we sit in a very momentous moment for our country in terms of how we think about trade. So it's great to have a debate like this today.
Thanks, Jeff. So As you said, there have been other times where we've seen similar movements. We can think about Japan and the US tensions in the 80s. But this moment seems somewhat different. And from your perspective, how do you see this as different versus what has happened in the past?
Yeah, so Renee, let me, and outline just a couple big themes, but I have to start with COVID, and that I think, we were already backsliding towards a more nationalist tendency before COVID hit, not just in the US, but on a global basis. And I think COVID laid on top of this some dynamics that made the global debate even tougher. It appeared, at least in the short term, like we overestimated the benefits of globalization with supply chain shut down, and we underestimated the risks of globalization. So I think you add to that a tough economy where every country is kind of fighting for itself right now in terms of job creation. The atmosphere, I think, is difficult when we think about where we sit today. And then I just add to that, China. I'm a long time global business person. I've seen China since the early 1980s, and it's just on the move. It's traded more aggressively than the U.S. over the last few years. It's moving to have trade deals on its own. Our historical trading partners are really willing to trade with China. They listen to what the U.S. says, but they're gonna tend to their own needs first. And so I think we just, you've got all those things going on at the same time. So I think, Renee, we're just in a time where we've had a vacuum in the U.S. and we need to kind of be more outward looking if we want to be a participant or more importantly, shape the global debate.
So I'd just like to follow up a little bit on that. Thanks, Jeff. I completely agree. So speaking of looking outwards, where would you look first for global cooperation, especially from the U.S. perspective?
It's really fantastic because I watch, as President Biden's taken over and he's bringing a new team, and he's had more experience, let's say, on the global stage. And the natural tendency in everything we do is to look towards Europe. And never get me wrong, Europe is an incredibly important partner and has been around for a long time. But the action's really in Asia. The action is, kind of China, ASEAN, India. That's where the economic growth is going to be. That's where the difficult dynamics are going to be. And that's where the focus, really has to be placed, just because that's where the action is right now. So I think, Renee, we need to shore up the relationships we've had in the past and make sure they don't fray any further. But I just can't envision a world where the two largest economies really don't talk to each other. That to me is just, it's a non-starter. And that's where I fear we are today.
So just kind of following up on that, and then I'll let Ethan give his line of questioning. So what about newer markets? India has been a market talked about for a long time, but recently African countries have been, getting their toes wet in this global discussion. And of course, the new Director General of the WTO is Nigerian and a woman. So what do you think the prospects are for African countries getting into this discussion?
I've been a long-term investor in Africa, and I would say, with all the volatility, kind of bullish about some of the markets. Again, there's no such thing as Africa. You almost have to divide it into, different regions that really matter in terms of the long-term growth. So you've got the populous countries like Nigeria, Egypt, some of those that need lots of healthcare and lots of development of the population. You've got resource-rich economies that need to transition and diversify their economies. And so you've got different needs in different places. But I do think that for people that are really can manage the risk-reward equation, this is going to be a fruitful place to invest. Now, the last thing I would say, Renee, is look, the Chinese are way ahead of us in most of the countries in Africa, right? If you go to a country like Ethiopia or Angola, the street signs are written in Mandarin, right? So we're not playing from a position really of strength. We're behind in most of these countries, and we have to find ways to rejuvenate, whether it's the Exim Bank or the World Bank or however we want to frame it. We have to rejuvenate our investments in the future in Africa.
Thank you. So that's a really interesting perspective. I certainly didn't know about the street signs in Angola being in Mandarin, but it's certainly a tell for how integrated the Chinese are in these African countries. So Ethan, if you're ready, I would like to turn it over to you a bit for a few questions for Jeff.
Yeah, sorry about that. Also dealing with some internet problems in the Zoom world. Jeff, I know you were briefly talking about mentioning the new Biden administration, changing politics and policies along with trade agreements as well. How do these decisions kind of play in respect to outsourcing manufacturing? Kind of like what role does policy uncertainty play in kind of when you're head of a company with kind of when you're outsourcing compared to jobs and kind of profits?
Yeah, Ethan, so maybe I'll give you a kind of a historical perspective and then maybe a wish list. I would say historically, and by historically, I'd say from, let's say, 1980 until the financial crisis, most of the global trade policies were pretty reliable, right? We all dealt with institutions that were put in place in the 1940s and 50s. Everybody played by a common set of rules. Things like the Exim Bank were generally embraced by both Republicans and Democrats. Trade deals were controversial, but were generally embraced as being win-win. And then the financial crisis hit, right? And politics got thrown up in the air. There was more nationalism. People took a longer, harder look and said, look, if you're a company, maybe in the past it was okay to shut down and move to Mexico or China and play kind of wage arbitrage games, but that's not the way we like the world to work anymore. So you got a sea change, not just in the US. Everybody thinks that it started in the US, but it really started, it was Europe, it was China, it was a bunch of different countries that were playing much more boundary nationalist games. And I think if you were a business over the last 10 or 15 years, if you weren't really thinking through a localization strategy, if you weren't finding out ways to make products in a country for a country, and with trade being less reliable, you missed the boat. Really, I think if you were a pharma company, let's say, and you had sole sourced a drug in China pre-COVID, you had to have your head examined, right? If you couldn't see that this was going to be a problem a decade ago, really. So, that's kind of a historical perspective, Ethan. I think what we'd love to see is maybe just restart the trade engine with some baby deals, with some very simple things that could get us back going in the business where the world had beneficial multilateral trade agreements that were simplistic and maybe just got us started down a path again. But middle-class jobs are critical, right? So at the end of the day, that's going to be the prism with which everybody looks at any trade deal in the future. And early back when I was in my old job, I worked on things like TTIP. I couldn't even envision starting that debate today, right? In the administration, it's so complicated, it's controversial, and I'm hoping that there are ways to just get started down the path again.
Yeah, so I know we're talking about supply chains today and manufacturing, but you mentioned TTIP. So a lot of these newer trade agreements are really trying to raise the standard. If we look at CPTPP, USMCA, and even what was discussed in TTIP, and the objective was not so much manufacturing, but really to think about services trade, think about IP. And so I'm just trying to figure out the contrast between thinking about manufacturing and the focus so far in manufacturing, even in what President Biden is discussing, and even some of the comments you've made so far, versus this focus on IP and services trade.
Mhm.
And in terms of where we're looking for having these new agreements, just wondering, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, I think high standards are good. I think that's a way that you can make trade agreements more palatable to the middle class without trying to be protectionist. So I actually think standards are a good thing. I think the difficult, I think whether this is right or wrong, this is the way it works, right? And at least my observation. The target job is what can a middle class, let's say blue collar worker, how can they develop their family and their profile and their future? Where are those jobs, right? That pay $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year, and that, whether it's right or wrong, that is the goal that everybody has, right? The magic goal. Those tend to be manufacturing jobs, maybe light services, small and medium enterprise, and so I think, and I understand that really. I don't say this to be judgmental at all. I just think that's where the state of play is. And so I think, Renee, that's going to be the focus of every trade deal, is to say, am I going to be a net winner or a net loser of those kinds of jobs? And those are going to be really, in profile. Now, I would add to it, Renee, in the spirit of, kind of the discussion we're having today with new manufacturing technologies, right? And by that, I mean, additive manufacturing, analytics, automation. Let's say in 1990, in my old life, we moved refrigerator production from Louisville, Kentucky to Mexico. And it was purely because labor was less expensive in Mexico than the US. I would say by 2021, that refrigerator can be made in the US at the same cost as Mexico, even though wages here are higher still. And there's probably fewer people making the refrigerator. That now is no longer something that has to be moved offshore. Now, whether that's good from the macro economy or not, I'll let smart economists decide that. But I think technology leads us to a different path if you're in the private sector today than maybe where it was over the previous decades. And I hope CEOs and business leaders are smarter about thinking through where they locate work, or let's say the flexibility with which they locate work.
So again, I'm gonna push you a little bit on that. So you mentioned that it would be fewer workers working in these factories, and that's what's helping to lower costs. There's more automation, but you also mentioned the need for these middle class families to have good jobs, good paying jobs. So the labor market dynamics don't quite work out, right? So these could be good paying jobs, but there's certainly going to be fewer of them.
Fewer of them than there were 20 years ago. Right. But they're in the US and not in other countries.
Okay, so in your view, that balances out in some sense. We're bringing them here to the US. So even though manufacturing overall might be using less labor, by bringing them back to the United States, you think the net effect on the labor market would be to boost.
I don't. Again, I think there needs to be more macro research that gets done, right? In other words, I got a very narrow view on this. I think what I would say from a business person standpoint, there's tremendous flexibility in terms of where you locate things today. And wages just are not as critically important as they might have been 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. That's really the point I'm making, Renee, is that basically people are going to be able to be much more flexible with where and how they make things.
Great, thanks. I see Ethan has joined us again. Ethan, why don't I turn it over to you for the next question?
Thank you. Apologize for that. I did hear, Jeff, you were talking about the blue collar workers and everything like that. In the times that we're at in the United States, with COVID pandemic not being 100% controlled, unemployment at about 6.3%, I guess, what advice do you have for both the federal government as well as private corporations in working together in order to kind of get a control and a hold on kind of the economic recovery and kind of help expedite that?
Yeah, I think, not only has the economy been impacted by COVID, but it's been disproportionate. So the digital world has done great. The physical world has gotten hammered. And by that, I mean manufacturers and service industry. And I could go down the list of all the different places that have been disproportionately affected. So I would look at this in stages, Ethan. I would say first and foremost, we need to get the vaccine out. We need to, kind of make sure that we administer the right recipe to the, kind of the United States economy that can get, stabilization in communities and all the things that kind of go with that. And then I just think we need a wave. I think we need President Biden to pick, whether it's clean energy or infrastructure. We need something that's investable, that can be done both by the public and private sector, and hopefully can create a meaningful wave of jobs. You know, I show my age because I was around when President Obama did his clean tech initiative in 2009, and it's easier said than done because there's a time lapse. Nonetheless, there's going to be really good jobs for installers and different areas in clean tech, and so I think that's a vector that we should go on for sure. But it's really time for infrastructure in this country. It really is a we watched this weather crisis kind of rip its way through the United States over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and when you think about kind of what's happened in Texas, it's really an infrastructure issue. It's a grid issue as much as it is freezing wind turbines and other things. And so, how to invest in that? What mechanisms? Is it deficit spending? Is it public-private partnership? But we've been talking about this now for at least 20 years. This is the right time, I think, to put a stake in the ground and let's go.
Yeah, so go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, to just add on to that, I was wondering, you were talking about kind of, certain sectors, did well during the COVID pandemic, others not so much. Do you think there will be a reshifting and restructuring of those blue collar jobs afterwards?
It's a great question, because the real answer to your question is I don't know. My hypothesis is that the physical world, once there's a vaccine, some things will stay on Zoom, but I think a lot of things are going to go back to the way we used to do them. I think people are going to get on planes, people are going to go to restaurants, they're going to stay in hotels. So there's some permanence to it, Ethan, but I do think that there's going to be some shifting back to, I wouldn't even call it normal, to a moment in time when we see other people to do work. We work with other people in an office, we go to restaurants and live a life that's around people instead of where we hide from each other.
Yeah, so I guess since we're touching on this topic of being in this online world, or even in these online webinars and conferences, we're kind of getting used to it, certainly in academia, doing these classes online. So I'm sort of wondering, as we're getting more and more used to this online world, and even education is more available, more easily accessible. Do you see a role for education sort of changing the game, even in manufacturing, even in the way we produce things? So you mentioned having these workers working in infrastructure, but would it be different types of infrastructure, and what's sort of the role of technology and education in helping to sort of spur that?
Yeah, so almost no renaissance of manufacturing can take place without training. And I think it's always critical to put that into the public domain and debate. Manufacturing tools today, let's say an operator on the factory floor, they now are kind of one part computer technician, one part artisan. People aren't, born into those skills. They have to be developed and they have to be trained. So whether we do that as a community, whether we do that using community colleges or high schools or military government programs and the like, there's going to be a huge need for real training. So if you just think about, I'll just pick one. I'll pick renewable energy installation. Right. So in some way, shape, or form, look, as much as we talk about renewable energy, it's like 6% of the US power generation. So there's going to continue to be, need for rooftop solar or wind turbine installation or new grid. And so, giving somebody the skills that can allow them to set up their own business to do rooftop solar or wind maintenance, those are the skills that are going to be needed over the next 10 or 20 years. And we don't have enough people for that. Electric vehicles are going to surpass, hydrocarbons in the next 20 or 30 years. I don't know how long it'll take. Those factories should be in the US, and that's going to take a new training mechanism to see how we bring those to the fore. So I think it's all about, getting people that can do the next generation of skills, not the last. And so training, I think from a state or from a national standpoint, that matters a lot. Renee, the last, I think, 4 factories we built as a company, but I mean factories, people making things, were in college towns, right? So even though, we weren't necessarily hiring college grads for everything, we found that the high schools in college towns tend to develop more aptitude than in other towns, right? So we were locating in West Lafayette, Indiana, because we were close to Purdue or other places. Even if we were hiring not all college grads, we were hiring 500, kind of hourly workers. So education and training matter a bunch.
That's really good to know. I know that's one of the discussions that's being circulated in policy circles. What's the right way to do this training? What's the right way even to go into these communities that are currently depressed that you might want to uplift? And certainly one of the possibilities is building schools there. So that looks like one possibility. So I wanted to kind of think more about these workers that might be moving into some of these manufacturing jobs you're mentioning in the new green economy, if you want to call it that, solar, wind. So in a sense, the sorts of manufacturing jobs that these folks might be moving into will be of a different nature than the sort of traditional manufacturing. And how do you think about these communities that are shifting these new technologies? So let's say a community that was heavily dependent on GE's manufacturing or manufacturing cars, moving into these different technologies. How smooth do you see that transition for these communities?
Yeah, I think that's, in some ways, this is going to be a new time for the country, and it's where I think some of the institutional work that you do with your team is going to help plow some of the ground for that. I think the one thing big companies do is we train people well. So my hope is that big companies maintain the charter to continue to upgrade people's skills, even if they're not going to work directly for us, that they can go to work for, in different industries and bring those skills. So I'd say one is we should play our role. 2, there's just going to be a real growth in small and medium enterprise that does a lot of the work along the supply chain. And so there's going to be a need for trade schools or community colleges so that the 100-person company can tap into, kind of how let's say the next generation training needs to take place. And then I think third, Renee, is it's just going to be virtual. There's just, I do venture capital now. There are cloud-based manufacturing companies that can kind of allow somebody to design a part and not own any software and pick the best place to manufacture it, and you do it all, kind of remotely. And so there's just going to be a wave of new technology. So, the fact is that no matter where you are in the supply chain, you're going to have digital skills. You're going to have computer skills, and people just can't. They can't avoid that. And we have a populist debate that goes on in our country where, let's say, I'm just mouthing now, I'm not being partisan, but Democrats are saying, teach people to code, and Republicans are saying, well, I want to have my old job, right? And that's the debate and the election. And I just think we need to be more nuanced as public leaders to say, hey, even your old job, even your old industries, they're not going to be able to survive unless people have rudimentary technical skills that are going to be important for the future. So we've turned this into a partisan debate where it really just should be practical about how people maintain good jobs.
So on that note, I've observed that there are myriad training programs that are sponsored by the government, sectoral training programs. There's an actual bill that has been, or a program, WIOA, that has been supported by the government for a long time for worker training. But a lot of the difficulty is matching that supply of talent to the demand for talent. Mm-hmm. And so what is sort of the role, or how do you see governments working with these large companies to make that match between supply and demand for talent?
Yeah, look, I think it's, that we've got to break it down into a community that can actually connect the dots. Maybe it's states. I know, Renee, you work in the state of California, but I think a state, pick any state, needs to be training people where the demand can be met, let's say inside that state. So in California, maybe it's healthcare and electric vehicles and solar installation. And I sometimes think we don't do enough connecting of the dots, and it can only be done in a community or in a state. Probably the state might be the best place to do it. So I think we've got to break it down into its pieces. And again, I think the private sector needs to play a very important role with respect to, kind of how we can train people and how we can offer our training programs to more than just the people that work at our companies. Yeah. The last thing I would say, Renee, over the next, 20 years, I just think, 1 in 3 people in the workforce are going to go to work in healthcare. And, you take a town like San Diego, has a very strong foundation in healthcare. And I think, you could play to that strength, both from a device manufacturing and things like that, but also in healthcare delivery service. So we should elevate and think through big change items like healthcare.
Yeah, so that sounds like a good place for the state of California to head. So I'm going to turn it over now to Ethan for the final question before we open it up to questions from the audience. Ethan.
Jeff, so far, thank you so much for a very insightful discussion. I do want to mention your book that's coming out, Hot Seat, where it talks about your time at GE and you face challenges and detractors. This question is more to the graduate students and myself included. What advice or recommendations do you have for us students who find themselves in difficult decisions that might not always be popular, and how to succeed from there?
Yeah, Ethan, so I really wrote the book for 2 reasons. One is I felt on behalf of my colleagues an incomplete story had been told, and I wanted to tell it. But I also felt like in the generation we live in is that all leadership is crisis leadership today. And I felt like, I'd been through plenty, and I felt like there was something to offer, right? So I would say that, in the world today, we've got to have people that know how to absorb fear, right? That can take it, can show people a way to make progress while not scaring them. And I think that's, we see it every day, right? And both public and private, but absorbing fear, that learn how to make decisions in a crowded room. I think particularly in a crisis, people don't want decisions to be made in a small closet somewhere. They want to see how the leader's making the decision, even if they want to be critical of them. There's nothing wrong with that. It shows them that you don't have any agenda. You have to keep a flexible point of view. Man, if anything, COVID has taught us the ability to hold 2 truths at the same time, which is the worst can happen and the best can happen. That's critical. And the last thing I'd say is just respect your team. Treat them with respect, help them find a path in this really volatile and ever-changing world. So I could say more than that. Thanks for plugging the book, but I'll leave it there so we can have plenty of time to answer questions.
Yeah, I think we could have a whole day of discussing these issues, but we're going to turn it over to questions. We encourage the audience to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. And so this is a great question from Gonzalo Lopez. What do you mean by the US shaping the discussion on world trade? And I'm going to also rephrase a little bit. There's a lot of discussion now that the US is stepping back from a leadership position in the world. What are your thoughts on the United States leading the world in global trade in this new discussion of the economy?
Yeah, so, I would preface it, Renee, to say, I was kind of a math and physics major in college, and then I just traveled the world, right? I went to work, and so the things I see in globalization, I don't have kind of an overarching view. It's kind of from a bottoms up of kind of living it for a long period of time. But if I would give you perspective, I would say, if you go back 70 years, most of the, global trade dynamics that were set in the 1940s and 50s, basically, that were shaped by the United States in multilateral fashion, that kind of were that was the guardrails for global trade for probably 70 years, right? And it's not that those institutions are wrong, it's just that they're dated. So that's number one. Number two, look, we've definitely pulled back. I mean, I hope I'm not saying anything that insults anybody, but over the past period of time, you can assess blame, but there's no doubt about it, we pulled back, and we now have a bilateral competitor that's unlike any competitor we've ever seen. So I think it was guardrails for 70 years, we pulled back, and now post-COVID, there's a whole open playing field again that needs our engagement. It needs our willingness to kind of get back involved in terms of what are the right ideas, what are the right processes, what's the right engagement, and that's lacking right now. So, everybody, I read different authors. People talk about G20, G7. Is it G2 today? Is it G0 today? We need to step into a new kind of context. That's what I would say. So engagement, prioritization. I think climate change is real. It's caused by man. It's existential. If we really want to move the needle, we need the US and China to develop some really great ideas that the rest of the world can also engage in. And that needs to happen now. Maybe that's a place to start.
Yeah, really important. So let me take another question from James DeBello. Pandemic exposed serious dependencies on foreign PPE manufacturing, as you mentioned earlier. 90% of generics are manufactured in Asia. You mentioned the need for big pharma to diversify or repatriate supply chains. What other industries should strategically repatriate their manufacturing to US or diversify supply chains? What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I would say, Renee, any boardroom who has a sole source in Asia, or any place for that matter, is taking significant enterprise risk for their institution, just because you've seen what, elements of trade that get blown up, you've seen what the pandemic has caused. And so I really think this was just a lack of really strategic planning and insight. And then I would add to it the fact that, with additive manufacturing and all the new manufacturing tools, you can make things in lots of different places. So I actually think we got lazy as a supply chain. We made it too simplistic. I'm not saying anybody needed to forecast COVID, but you could certainly have seen trade wars on the horizon. And trade wars, when it comes to making things one place and shipping them someplace else, can have as debilitating effect as natural disasters can have. So I think boards have to drive it, governments can facilitate it. I don't like, I hate to see the tariff wars we're having, because at the end of the day, they don't turn out to be very smart, right? One person starts, the other person matches, and it's really hard to bring them back into control someday. But my hope is that risk management, boardrooms, the private sector has other ways to regulate bad strategic decisions.
No, that's good. It's interesting because there's a lot of talk now about industrial policy again. And we should learn from mistakes in industrial policy, but there's certainly a role for the government to be thinking about which places to put their money, I should say.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so speaking of which, so Robert Schmidt asks, so going back to this conversation about training and workforce and education, how do you envision paying for this training? What's the balance between government and private sector responsibility?
Yeah, I think so if you think about deficit spending, where the country is right now, and whether there's another big pandemic relief plan or not, I gotta believe that in a $2 trillion relief package, there's room for training. Okay. I mean, I just can't envision that that's not some aspect of how we're thinking about reshaping the economy for the future. Beyond that, I think the private sector has to lean in and say, look, if I have a company in San Diego, and I'm going to invest in my training and actually invest in the local community colleges or other training centers, that every small and medium enterprise in town should be able to piggyback off that. I actually think that's a no-brainer for business, something we've done for a long time and should be talked about and amped up. So I think some combination of public expenditures, particularly where we are right now, and private sector. But look, I think, again, I'm 65 years old. I look at our debt to GDP, and I never thought I'd see the United States where we are. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, for sure. But if we're going to make that kind of investment, let's say, or deficit spending, we need to direct as much as we can to really rebuilding the next generation of worker in the country.
So just following up on that, Jeff, you and I had a conversation yesterday on exactly this topic, not yesterday, Friday, on exactly this topic. Again, there's so many demands on this relief bill. We've got COVID, we've got the downturn. Folks need their incomes back, right? Maybe there is less to be available for education. The WIOA program significantly had reductions in the amount committed to it. It was on the order of about $1 billion in the last allocation, which is nothing for a federal program. So how do you see the government balancing that? And again, going back to the private sector, going back to private individuals, we're thinking about this K-shaped economy. Let's be honest, folks at the top have had incredible benefits from the last year. Folks at the bottom at the same time are really suffering. What is the role for individuals who have the wealth, who have those incomes, to be thinking about where they can contribute to this relief, whether it's in government, whether it's directly in incomes, education, what is it?
Oh gosh, that's such an all-encompassing question. I think the country, President Biden needs to lead us through, COVID and get us to the other side by delivering the vaccine and making the initial investments back in the economy. So I think we have to do that. And then I just think, Renee, we've got to kind of stand up and look in all directions as a country and say, do we need a different tax policy? Do we need a different education plan? Clearly, we're gonna end COVID in an economic state that is unsustainable, even for the United States, and it's not anything where we want to be. So, I don't disagree with you at all. I think the wealth discrepancy is a big issue in the country. It's multifaceted, and we need to start delivering investments that work on that. And if it needs a change in tax policy to help us get there, that's what we should debate and discuss. And I don't think it's necessarily a specific partisan issue. I think it's a, let's solve problems together kind of issue in terms of how to address it. So I hope your institute's working on this, because I'm not sure.
Well,
I'm not sure I have an
that's
answer,
the goal.
but I can certainly describe the problem.
We can all describe the problem very well, but I can tell you that it's something we think about quite a bit. And we're hoping after today that we can put some concrete ideas on the table. I did want to get to a question from Michael Davidson, going back to the discussion about China and sort of bringing jobs back here, and thinking about Chinese firms in manufacturing. So even if we start thinking about bringing jobs back here or distancing ourselves from China a little bit, this sort of puts China more in a position to take a leadership role in the rest of the world. So, again, if we want to have some impact on how sustainable production can be, and the Chinese we want to think about how we can encourage our trading partners and the places we're sourcing from to have these higher standards of ethics in production, but then the Chinese come along, or some other country comes along with lower standards, and so they're saying, okay, how do we make this choice? All right, and likely they're going for the less difficult standards to maintain. So, how do you see that balancing act?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize China for what it is. And again, I need to preface this by saying there's a whole kind of geo-military look that I'm not qualified to address, right? So if you had a general on the call instead of a retired CEO, you'd get a different contextual answer. But if I can, Renee, if I can just speak for the economics, China exists. It's going to be big. It's going to grow. It almost doesn't matter what we do at this point. It has hit its own escape velocity. It's graduated more engineers than the US and Europe combined for 30 years. They're into high tech. Is IP theft an issue in China? Sure it is. And it's been there for a long time. But I would say that the bigger concern today is the fact that they're innovating more rapidly than we are in some areas, right? So given all that, I'd like to focus on engagement. I'd like to focus on getting some kind of economic system that works, where US companies can invest and grow in China, and we can have Chinese companies also do the same in the United States and globally. But I think we're a little naive when it comes to the fact that they've got their strategy, they've got their investments, and it's just hard for us to control the game. And I think the last 4 years have told our historic trading partners that we're not as reliable as we used to be, and they're going to form their own relationships. The last thing I would say, Renee, and I mean this very sincerely, which is when I was Ethan's age, I thought I had to learn how to compete in every country in the world, that there was no choice. There was no choice. My fear is that we're training our students in the United States today, and we're saying, look, China cheats, don't go there, don't learn it, don't compete there. And if we have a generation of American students, whether in business or another area, who basically say, I'm going to take China off my economic map, that's a bad thing. And I see that and feel that and worry about that dramatically.
So now that sets us up for the last question I'll be able to take from our list today. And I apologize for not getting to all our questions. Actually, I'll take 2 more questions from the list. So if you had a company and you required skilled labor for manufacturing, and you wanted to pick a single place to put a plant in the world, where would you pick?
It depends where the market is. Yeah, I think today it's all about markets. I think today it's really where you make is really related to where you sell. 20 years ago, where you made and where you sold were irrelevant. Today, where you make and where you sell is essentially important. And manufacturing is part of your marketing strategy today. So look, I tried to train our team to not be afraid to invest anywhere and to always use it as a way that we could grow successfully around the world, including the United States, which was always a very important market for us.
So sort of embedded in that answer is the old model of outsourcing to bring these finished products back to some location is somewhat not the right model for now.
I think it's old, Renee, I think it's old playbook. I think it's kind of, not that it still doesn't happen, but it's old playbook. New playbook is win in markets and use manufacturing as a wedge or a competitive advantage to help you win there.
Yeah. So last question I'll put to you from Keith Mascus is, we're thinking about nationalism now in the treatment of data privacy, cross-border data flows. Do you see any role for multilateral cooperation on this? Or again, is this something that we want to think about more narrowly, a small group of countries making agreements on this?
It's a great question. I'd say the answer is no. It's too late for data privacy. I'd say even small agreements are going to be very, very difficult. I just think it's just too late. People see the damage that cyber terror can bring. While it probably would be better to have everybody in the same, playing field, I think people see risk first and opportunity second. So, I'm not from the tech sector, but I've hung around it a long time. I think maybe a decade ago, we could have maybe shaped this in a different way. Today, I think it's just too late. So I think we're going to go through a time period where, one country, one cloud. Right? That's just going to be where we stand for a while until we kind of get our mutual act together. The last thing I'd say, Renee, you guys, the people on the call are probably smarter than I am about this, but I always looked at Europe as the regulatory superpower. Probably the most important regulator in the world is Commissioner Vestager in Europe, and I think she's going to be, I look very much at what they do as it pertains to the tech industry and cyber.
Yeah, so we do know the Europeans are much more comfortable with those sort of multinational rules than certainly a country like the United States.
Yeah.
This has been a really wonderful discussion. I want to give Ethan the opportunity to ask any last questions, and then Jeff, I'll give you the floor for the last couple of minutes.
Thanks, Renee.
I just want to say once again, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. It was really insightful, engaging, and also very encompassing and a lot of things to think about as we kind of move forward, as well as thank the attendees for joining us. And then Jeff, for the last minutes, the floor is yours.
Hey, great, Renee and Ethan. So thanks to UCSD. I think you've got a great program going. And I looked at the attendees on the, kind of on the call. You're in the heart of I'd say this debate. We need a new playbook. I think globalization is critical. I grew up, I see the benefits. I'm a believer.
Unfortunately, it seems we have lost Jeff for these critical last comments. Let's give Jeff just one more minute. In the meantime, I do want to thank the audience again for being a part of this discussion. The questions have been wonderful. The questions are great. And I really hope you can continue to join the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy on our future events. We hope to have more discussions like this in the future with great world leaders. If Jeff does not have a chance to make those final comments, I hope we can record them and stick them onto this, but this recording will be available online. Ethan, I'll allow you to wrap up.
Cool. Thank you so much for everyone joining. It was a pleasure being part of this. Renee, thank you so much, as well as for the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy.